On April 8th, 2017, Reddit user P.A. Leskowitz posted a link to a YouTube channel simply called Petscop on r/creepygaming. The post was entitled, "Videos of a mysterious unfinished PSX game from 1997 called Petscop. There's something hiding in it." The first video on the channel shows off what Petscop ostensibly is, a friendly-looking Pokemon kind of game in which the player must catch pets by solving puzzles. But, as the original post suggested, this bright facade is a mask that hides something much more sinister. Beneath the surface, a dark, surreal nightmare begins to unfold. Censored objects, references to real-life tragedies, and bizarre, inexplicable enigmas in time are all entangled in a gradually unraveling narrative of a dysfunctional family haunted by a curse from the past. Petscop is a profoundly enthralling mystery. It's atmospheric, surreal, disturbing, weird, and a pioneer of its genre. There's so much to analyze in every frame of this series, so much so, in fact, that analyzing it is a pretty tall order. I've followed Petscop since the start, and while its moment is kind of over, it really was a cultural reset for YouTube unfiction and YouTube horror in general. And honestly, it is kind of timeless. Every couple years, a different YouTuber I watch releases a new great analysis on it, and I feel like because it's so open-ended, discussion of it never really gets old. Everyone has a unique interpretation. However, I don't want this video to just be me sitting here recounting Petscop to you. That actually was what this originally was, which is why it was going to be 3 parts, but I started actually making it, and it was like the most dry thing imaginable. I'm not interested in just flatly summarizing something you can go watch yourself for free and have a better experience. This isn't my audition to be the next Wendigoon, and plus there's plenty of people out there who have already done a much better job at that. I'd personally recommend Sagan Hawks' video for a good basic summary and analysis. Also, I don't mean basic as an insult, by the way, I just mean it's beginner-friendly, since Petscop can get real convoluted real fast. Regardless, I'm far more interested in the themes of Petscop, and I think Petscop itself is too. I can sit here and assemble a very objective timeline fairly easily, but I don't think that's what Petscop really wants you to do. The game itself is more of a vessel with which to explore these concepts, not the main focus of the series. The story's not about an evil video game, it's about abuse, trauma, and perspective. That's not to say I don't think there's any value to be had in trying to find a coherent narrative, but I think it's worth trying to find a coherent narrative through the themes. So that's mostly what I plan to do in this video. Analyze the themes and then apply them to the story and see how I can make a story that makes sense in a less than literal way. So with all that being said, we have a lot of ground to cover today, so I'm not going to waste time any longer. Let's get right into it. The first thing I want to talk about is one of the most prominent motifs in Petscop, duality. This theme is embodied in the nature of the game itself. By putting in the code you switch to a different side, see an altered version of the game. This also applies to the generation mechanic, most clearly exemplified in Petscop 9 where we see an altered version of Even Care, and this is emphasized even further with the treadmill. Not only do we have the loves me not imagery tied to the daisy, a duality in and of itself, there's also the correlation that this mechanic has to the daisy in the newmaker plane. While there's plenty of examples I could list, I'd be remiss not to mention the most glaring example, Paul himself. Paul has all the same attributes as Care, similar appearance, same birthday, and apparently they even both had conversations in which they got in an argument about the discovery pages. Paradoxically, Paul seems entirely oblivious to Care's existence until he plays Petscop. He seems particularly baffled by the idea that he wouldn't have remembered a member of his family, especially a child, going missing. And, you know, it's a valid question. That would be a pretty major event to forget, especially when the game seems largely centered on Care and her disappearance, and it basically uprooted the entire family. This ties into a theme that falls neatly in line with duality, perspective, perhaps the most important theme in Petscop. So, riddle me this. Imagine there are 2 pictures of a door. In one image the door is closed, and in the second the door is open. Nobody opened the door, and the door didn't open itself. In fact, the door never opened at all. How is this possible? Well, picture it like this. If I take a picture of the door like this, then it looks closed, right? But look what happens when I, the camera person, move. The door was never closed, it was just ajar. I just needed to change my perspective to see it that way. This principle is crucial to understanding Petscop and the anomalies therein. It's important to remember that this story is being told by Rainer, and we're seeing it from his point of view. And Rainer has some, well, interesting outlooks. Often his writings in the game will veer off into his vaguely unhinged musings about the nature of life and his thoughts on the events happening in the game. One of my favorite examples of this is in Petscop 6, when his description of Ronith becomes this ramble about a dog who is never the same after being hit by a car. I wanted to highlight this example in particular because it demonstrates Rainer's perspective on death. The way Petscop talks about death is interesting because it isn't really in a literal sense. According to Rainer, death seems to be an irreversibly traumatic event. It might literally kill you in some cases, but as demonstrated by the dog, it could just be something that affects you for the rest of your life. The description of Care echoes a similar sentiment when talking about Care, but also Michael. I told you all we would never find Care A. When Care goes missing, she goes missing forever. My brother didn't want us to find him because he knew we were all looking for Michael A. I don't think Michael truly died. He only died in Raynor's eyes because of his weird outlook on death, like how Carrie went missing forever when Marvin kidnapped her. Michael A. died whenever he suffered whatever traumatic incident he did. This is mostly immaterial to the overall point I'm trying to make, but I did just want to say for the record that yes, I think it's almost certain that Michael was hit by a car. Aside from all the car and car accident imagery across the series in general, Michael is strongly associated with Ronith, who in turn is associated with the dog who was hit by the car. But anyway, because of Michael not wanting to be found, and the fact the dog is explicitly said to have survived, combined with Raynor's weird idea of death, I feel comfortable saying Michael didn't actually die. This is also the answer to the anomaly of Lena Leskowitz. Ostensibly, Lena is dead. Her grave tells us that she died in 1979, presumably a result of whatever happened at the windmill with Marvin. And Rayner seems to believe this is the case, considering the scene in Petscop 8 where Paul uses the tool on her in the windmill, resulting in her disappearing and Paul gaining several pieces. However, this is contradicted by the epilogue, in which we learn that she's seemingly the adoptive mother of Paul and Belle. So what gives? Well, again, we only know what Rayner knows. He seemingly learned about Lena's existence by snooping through Marvin's things, and since he seems to be predisposed to having a pretty negative opinion of him, it makes sense for him to assume that Marvin was responsible for whatever happened to her. This, combined with Anna referring to her as an aunt that not everyone can see, leads me to believe that Lena didn't really die. That was just Rayner's impression because, as the epitaph on her tomb reads, they didn't see her. On that note, this would also explain what happened with the windmill. Rayner is accusing Marvin of making an entire windmill disappear at the age of, 9. That's a pretty tall order. But again, think of the door riddle. The door never opened and the door never closed, it was just seen from a different angle. This logic can also be applied to the windmill incident. The windmill never disappeared, the picture was just taken from a different point of view. Anna took the first picture with Marvin and Lena, then Lena A disappeared, as Rayner would put it, and then she took another picture of Marvin without the windmill, probably shaken by whatever happened to Lena. Admittedly, it is a little weird that she thought that was appropriate, but I don't know, maybe she was trying to cope by ignoring it. That would be corroborated by Rayner's claim that Anna won't admit that something happened to Lena at the windmill. Overall, the understanding of the windmill incident encapsulates Rayner's main flaw. He's blinded by his own fixation and inability to see things from a different perspective. I saw a Reddit comment recently that did a pretty good job of summarizing how he's Marvin's foil. Marvin is obsessed with the past and trying to bring it back, whereas Rayner views all change as irreversible and has these very arbitrary views of when something is beyond saving. See his note about how some children could be damaged beyond rebirthing in Petscop 2. Needless to say, neither of these are very healthy outlooks on life. That's enough on Rayner for now, but I definitely will get back to him. What does any of this have to do with Paul and Care? Well, apply the principle I described earlier. Most of Petscop's paradoxes can be solved by just looking at them from a different perspective. If Paul has the same appearance, birthday, and even the exact same conversations as Care, then it follows that he is, in fact, Care, just from a different point of view. But, how? What does that mean? How can two people occupy one body? Well, this has been my personal explanation of choice for a while, and I'm surprised it's not as discussed as it is, because to me it's the simplest answer. Paul has dissociative identity disorder. Now, I am by no means any kind of expert on DID, and it is still a very stigmatized disorder, so I'm going to cover this fairly briefly. If anyone with more knowledge than I on this subject cares to, please leave a comment correcting me or adding any addendums, or saying that this wouldn't make sense for some reason. That being said, from my limited knowledge, this explanation resolves a lot of the weird circumstances surrounding Paul. It would explain why he doesn't remember Care or her disappearance at all, and also why he apparently hasn't seen his family in years. It also accounts for Paul's fuzzy memories and his confusion regarding things like differentiating his left and right. Building upon that, Rayner tells Care that, at some point, your movement stopped making sense, bumping into walls and doors, dodging invisible obstacles, and later, in the scene of the counselor, not only do they highlight Care having the same left-right confusion as Paul, they reassure her that, when you reach for your shoes, they will be there. When you walk through a doorway, the door will be open. Wherever you go, the floor will continue under your feet. Again, these symptoms feel consistent with dissociation to me. I don't have any experience with DID, but I do have experience with dissociation, and those traits seem to line up pretty well. I definitely understand that surreal, almost out-of-body feeling that's being described. Another thing I wanted to talk about regarding the counselor sequence is the counselor telling Care that kids shouldn't say swear words. This lines up with the iconic scene in Petscop 14 where Care is arguing with Aunt Jill, who isn't there, to the confusion and concern of her mother. Where are the discs? Where are the discovery pages? What are you talking about? What discs? What discovery pages? Jill, stop fucking ignoring me. Get in here and show me where that disc is. No, Care, this is Mommy. This is your mommy, sweetie. I'm right here in front of you. There's no one else here. Paul then expresses discomfort because it apparently bears a striking resemblance to a conversation he had on his last birthday. Okay, so admittedly I have no explanation for Care knowing about the Discovery pages in the 90s. That's one of the few points that I'm willing to understand the theories about actual space-time manipulation on. However, I don't think that's necessarily the point this scene is trying to make. I think that in this moment Care is dissociating, falling into her Paul identity. While Paul isn't exactly a super outwardly emotional person,
that's a dead kid.
He does have something of a sailor's mouth.
Fuck.
And if he did indeed have an argument with Aunt Jill similar to the one that Care had, then he does have the capacity for verbal outbursts. From my, again, very limited understanding, DID largely develops as a way to fill a void created by your trauma. Again, not an expert by any means, so correct me if I'm wrong. In any case, I feel like that's why Paul was created. He's a response to all the adults that should have protected Care and rather directly facilitated her trauma. He's like an older brother that she never had. On that note, I'd like to segue into discussing a contested topic in the community, the demo sequences. There's been a lot of discussion about what these scenes mean. Some have suggested that they're recordings from prior play sessions, actual ghosts trapped in the game, or even AI simulacra of the game's players. For the record, I personally think AI simulacra is the most likely possibility, and I'll get into that more later, but I also don't think it really matters that much. It's like, okay, that's nice. What does it mean, though? What do AI simulacra mean thematically? No, I think the demo sequences are first and foremost a vessel to convey something more to do with the meta-narrative. Consider the start of the first demo sequence in Petscop 11. We travel forward through the tunnel and then see a ticking clock superimposed on the screen. But then something strange happens. Did you catch it? The clock itself is moving. Turn it upside down, or should I say look at it from a different perspective, and you'll see that time is stopped, or perhaps it's moving backwards, a direct response to Paul's question to Toole about the school. So, what is this to say? Well, I think that symbolically, this is telling us that Paul is going back in time, whether he's having a flashback or dissociating or something else. In oh wait, they literally have a pronunciation guide in there about. In Mysticete's rotation theory video, which you should absolutely watch, by the way, I think they put it best.
But I would wager that if you were Carrie Mark and you were experiencing this part of the game, it would very much feel like you were being warped back in time, or like time had never progressed since that moment.
While diegetically the demos possibly and likely are AI simulacra, their purpose in the meta-narrative is to tell us more about Care's past as well as her/Paul's relationship with Marvin and Belle. This is most clearly seen in Petscop 23 in what is, in my opinion, one of the most poignant moments in the entire series. After identifying his ghost room, Marvin says, "Here I come," and suddenly the game abruptly stops, implying that something is happening in the real world. After this, Belle enters the room and says, "I'm sorry," prompting Paul to simply respond with, "Help." God, this is such a tragic, haunting moment. It shows two kids trapped in the same abusive, horrific situation, but unable to help each other in any meaningful way. In a narrative sense, though, I think these scenes are supposed to tell us more about what Care and Belle went through while under Marvin's captivity, in a less than literal sense, and this is a perfect demonstration of that. On that note, I want to talk about the idea of rebirthing a little bit, because it's one of the most prominent ideas we see throughout the series. So what does this rebirthing actually entail? Well, I doubt it involves an actual machine like it does in the game, but I'm almost sure it has something to do with the piano. In Petscop 11, when Paul enters the classroom, Marvin tells him to play music for baby, she will become melody. When Paul begins to play, he plays what's called Care's theme in the captions, but eventually the melody changes. The notes become red, the color associated with Paul, and Marvin becomes displeased, telling him that Tiara plays bad music too. This scene has always stuck out to me because it's informed an increasingly popular interpretation of Paul as transmasc or GNC in some way. And I think to an extent he is. After all, under my reading, he's a male alter in a female body. This scene, though, seems to be a more direct take on that idea. When Paul plays Care's melody, Marvin is happy. He's resonating with his birth identity, for lack of a better term. But when he starts to play his own melody, Marvin becomes displeased. Let's talk about melodies. If, as Marvin suggests, a melody represents one's identity, or you become who you are through the melody you play, then we see why Marvin is displeased by Paul/Care playing their own melody. As we learned all the way back in Petscop 2, Marvin was excited to learn Care wasn't growing any eyebrows, probably because that would make her easier to rebirth, as that's one of Lena's signature traits. It's possible, and perhaps likely, that for other victims, such as Belle, their eyebrows were manually plucked out, indicated by the tweezers. Even if it's not Lena's melody she plays, Care is a lot closer to Lena than Paul is. It's also possible that her melody and Care's are one and the same. There you go again, two seemingly distinct things that are actually one if you just change how you look at them. On that note, pun fully intended, I'd like to talk about a bit of music theory. In Petscop 12, Raynor tells Belle that he put her inside the machine and played the second movement of Stravinsky's septet on the needles. The septet can also be heard in Petscop 7 in the Quitter's room when Belle disappears from the opposite side.
Something's happening.
That seems very highly specific, so it's clear that this wasn't an arbitrarily chosen piece, and as it happens, it has droves of symbolism tied to it. The septet represents a shift in Stravinsky's compositional style, from a neoclassical style to a new serialized form. To quote Wikipedia, all of the septet is characterized by highly contrapuntal textures, but the first movement remains close to Stravinsky's earlier manner, whereas the remaining two exhibit his emerging new style. That is to say, movement 2 represents a bridge between those two eras. The second movement is everything. The Passacaglia, that's where the big change occurs. One might call it a rebirth in his artistic style, perhaps. Moreover, a Passacaglia is a style of music writing in which a harmony progresses based on a consistent bass line. Again, a transition, a rebirth. There's also another aspect of the septet I'd like to mention. Take a listen to this again. Now if you're like me, this might sound flat and gross to you, and that's because this is composed in a style called 12-tone serialism, or dodecaphony. This is kinda hard to explain because it's very theoretical, but the vast majority of songs you listen to use major-minor tonality, where all the tones are balanced in relation to each other and you have one strong bass tone that ties everything together. Basically, you want a nice economy of tones. Dodecaphony, conversely, represents all tones equally. There's not really a consistent through line to the music, and in my opinion, you just can't convey the same narrative arc that you can with major-minor tonality. So, okay, that's cool. But what's this all to say as it relates to Petscop? Well, dodecaphony has often been criticized for sounding soulless and robotic, like trying to reduce music to an objective science rather than an art form that conveys a story or a feeling. And doesn't that sound kind of familiar? Marvin doesn't want Paul to play his own melody, he forces him to play Cares. Again, remember that your melody is your identity. Rather than playing the song that reflects who he truly is, he's forced to play a song that doesn't really represent that. Another thing I'd like to add to this point is the description of Pen. While Paul clicks through Pen's description pretty quickly, if you pause to read it, it's pretty interesting. Pen is an aspiring mathematician. She's entirely deaf. She doesn't know what music is. I don't know what she's even doing here. I think that this description is actually from the perspective of an overly harsh piano teacher. Fortunately, all my piano teachers have been, like, the best ever, so I can't relate. But you get what I mean, right? Like, she's so bad at piano, you'd think she's deaf, or does she even know what music is supposed to sound like? This is probably reflective of the attitude Marvin had towards Care when she wouldn't or couldn't play her melody properly. Again, he approaches music in this very finite way. There's one right way to play the song, and if you diverge from it at all, then you're wrong and you're a bad musician. It's again that idea of trying to reduce music to a science rather than an art. Anyway, that was a tangent, but I think it was a necessary one given what I want to talk about next, Belle. Belle has always been one of the weirder parts of Petscop to me, mostly because I struggle to understand how she fits into this whole puzzle. Petscop 12 probably gives us the most information about her since the episode's entirely from her perspective, but it's honestly one of the most confusing episodes in the series to me. For starters, we know that she's not part of the family, at least not biologically, which is why her features aren't in the child library. According to Raynor, she was supposed to be reborn as Tiara. He called her by that name prematurely and put her in the machine while he played the septet. Because she gave up halfway through, though, the rebirth was unsuccessful and she was presumably locked away in the Quitter's room. I figured now is as good a time as any to discuss the allusions to Candace Newmaker, since Belle is the character who is the most strongly tied to them. I won't go into great detail on this, since that's not really my job, and also I don't think I could without becoming furiously livid, but I will leave a link in the iCard to a video by Rainbot about the case if you want to learn more. Content warning for child abuse and child death. This is incredibly loaded. Essentially, Candace Tiara Elmore, the adoptive child of Jean Newmaker, was forced to partake in a type of attachment therapy called rebirthing, in which Candace would attempt to emulate the process of being born by crawling out of a tight wrapping of blankets to represent the birth canal. Through this method, she was supposed to become more attached to her adoptive mother. Also, side note, attachment therapy is very controversial and is often considered pseudoscience, so take that for what you will. Jean and the two therapists all sat on top of her in this cocoon. When she claimed she couldn't do it and was struggling to breathe, the therapist mocked her and called her a quitter. Once the session ended, the blankets were unwrapped, and there was Candace, lying dead in a pool of her own vomit. It's an utterly harrowing case, and it fills me with rage and sadness every time I recall it, and the references to it in Petscop are pretty clear. We have the Quitter's Room, questions about birth and rebirth, allusions to characters named Newmaker and Tiara, the huge motif of adoption in general. I could go on. However, creator Tony Domenico has said that he regrets including the references to Candace's story. Petscop is not about Candace Newmaker. The references to her exist to build the theme. Even so, perhaps this can give us some insight about what happened to Belle. Perhaps she was an adoptive child either of Marvin or Jill. Raynor tried to integrate her into the family by rebirthing her with the new name Tiara by putting her in a machine, and played the second movement of Stravinsky's septet on the piano, Tiara's melody. However, she gave up halfway through, and as a result, she did not become Tiara. Maybe then she was locked in some equivalent to the Quitter's Room, which I have more thoughts I'll get to later. Okay, so that's all well and good, but there's still some glaring questions here. Namely, 1, what's the deal with Belle playing the game for 17 years? And 2, why did Raynor try to rebirth her and not Marvin, even though Raynor is ostensibly anti-rebirth and anti-Marvin? For the first one, I feel fairly confident in saying it has something to do with the aforementioned AI simulacra. Again, I don't really care to explain all the nitty-gritty of this, partially because I don't think I could do so sufficiently, and partially because I just don't find it that interesting. But there is one element that I think not a lot of people have mentioned with regard to it. A lot of people have made connections to the idea of a Darwinian learning algorithm, and I think these are definitely valid ones. Essentially, algorithms like this send out a whole bunch of AI test subjects, and the ones that perform the desired action advance to the next phase, with the requirements for each generation getting more and more specific until you reach your final goal. You know, like that natural selection thing. We can see this in action in Petscop 17, where Paul enters a room impulse in which a bunch of players are seen moving around nonsensically, and a dial can be used to cycle through the different stages of the AI's evolution, with the eventual goal being for them to develop an AI that's a near one-to-one simulacra of care. So yes, all that is to say I think there is almost certainly an element of machine learning at play here. However, this explanation has always been a little too easy, I guess. I don't know, I just find it hard to believe that Raynor managed to design this insanely complex, likes of which the world has never seen before, learning algorithm in the space of like 5 years max using a PSX dev kit. And don't get me wrong, I'm absolutely willing to suspend my disbelief with Petscop because it's Petscop, but like I said earlier, what does that really mean? In a series so abstract and theme-based, this concept on its own feels horrifically literal, quite honestly. Therefore, I propose something that's hopefully a little more interesting and thematically tight. When Paul first enters the classroom where he plays the needles in Petscop 11, this hidden loading screen can be seen if you brighten up the screen. A piano with a PlayStation controller attached. In the schematic of the ghost room, this same piano can be seen. So, okay, what about it? Well, recall what Raynor said about how he put Belle in the machine. While for a while I struggled to understand what that meant in a meta-narrative sense, I think it makes a lot more sense if you think about it in the way that he's talking to Belle, the AI. He put her into the machine. That is to say, he recreated her in Petscop. But how did he do that? Well, again, let me remind you that your melody is your identity, and the septet is Tiara's melody. By playing one's melody, Raynor is able to create a simulacra of someone in the game. If she played the septet, Tiara would have been uploaded, but because Belle gave up halfway through, she only played her own melody. This is also probably why she was playing Petscop for 17 years, and why Raynor has to tell her about what happened after the failed rebirth. This AI simulacrum of Belle is a version of her captured as she was 17 years ago, and to me this principle applies to the game as a whole. This house riddle also points at this. This is a frozen house, captured 3 times exactly as it was. Petscop is a capture of the way things were in 1997. This is also why the demo sequences often take place in the school and reflect the events of the past. This Belle only knows what 17 years ago real-life Belle did. You could also tie this back to what I said earlier about Raynor's flaw being his fixed perspective, because even though a melody represents your identity, a melody isn't static, right? A melody has a sense of narrative progression and arc, just like a person. The septet was probably selected for this reason. As I said before, with atonality, this piece doesn't really progress in the same way as most songs do. Raynor's fixed perspective doesn't allow him to see that people change, and by extension, you can't force someone to be something they aren't. Belle can't just become Tiara by playing Tiara's melody, she'd have to transition from her melody into the septet, and that's if she even wanted to become Tiara in the first place, which I doubt. This framework can also inform the aforementioned readings of Petscop as being about gender to some extent. By making her play the septet, Belle is forced to become someone she's not to fit into the family. It's a struggle that I and other gender non-conforming people can relate to, feeling pressured to conform to the person that your family wants or expects you to be. It can cause kind of an identity crisis. This can also apply to the concept of not fitting into your family in general, and one that can be mapped onto other reasons such as ethnic or cultural, but since gender and identity are themes that are fairly prevalent in Petscop, and it's the one that I personally relate to the most, it's the one I find the most compelling. On that note, I'd like to transition, there were 2 puns that time, into discussion of the second question I proposed earlier, that being why Rainer even tried to rebirth Belle to begin with. I feel like this point is often brushed over, and most explanations I have seen for it leave something to be desired for me, but I saw a Reddit comment recently that made me reconsider a lot about him. The idea that Rainer is a former victim of rebirthing himself. I'd like to preface this section by looking at Rainer's name itself. It's kind of an unusual alias, right? Like, how do you get Rainer from Daniel? Well, let me tell you a bit about esteemed German poet Rainer Maria Rilke. The first glaringly obvious thematic connection you can make to Petscop is that, despite being a biological male, Rilke's mother raised him as a girl in his early life, coping with the loss of a baby girl she'd had before Rainer. So, yeah, I don't think that needs much explanation. Anyway, let's talk about Rilke's body of work. A lot of Rilke's work focuses on his relationship with religion and religious existentialism. While religion itself isn't really a concept that comes up in Petscop, I think Rainer's weird nihilistic views and perspective on death could definitely apply to Rilke's poems. A few lines that specifically jumped out at me were from the first of the Dueno elegies. Who, if I cried out, would hear me among the angelic orders? And even if one were to suddenly take me into its heart, I would vanish into its stronger existence. For beauty is nothing but the beginning of terror that we are still able to bear, and we reverse it so, because it calmly disdains to destroy us. Every angel is terror, and so I hold myself back and swallow the cry of a darkened sobbing. This passage felt reminiscent of the likes of Roneth or Care A's descriptions. What's the point in seeking salvation when we're so infinitesimally small in the face of such cosmically massive powers? What's the point in trying to find Care A? When Carrie goes missing, she goes missing forever. What's the point in trying to rehabilitate the dog? After all, every time it smiles, it's fake. It's not like it was before. The last line about swallowing a dark and sobbing is also especially interesting to me, as it brings me back around to my initial point with this section. The idea that Rainer was a former, or potentially even the first, victim of rebirthing. When he was a child, Marvin might have attempted to rebirth his nephew, maybe they had piano lessons together or something, and eventually he was goaded into perpetuating this horrible cycle. Think like Mr. Jefferson and Nathan Prescott from Life is Strange. This resulted in his failed attempt to rebirth Belle around 1994 and 1995, and following this, either because of this or because of what happened to Michael, or both, Rainer realized how fucked this all was. As a result, he turned Petscop into a project to expose Marvin and, in turn, himself for his crimes. Suffice it to say that I think that explanation of Rainer makes a lot more sense and is also just more thematically tight. Nextpo's video characterized Rainer as being a very one-track mind and solely focused on avenging Michael, but I don't think that's necessarily the case, especially when this game is, by and large, about care. And, I don't know, Rainer doesn't strike me as selfish, just deeply traumatized and stuck in a fixed perspective. He did really want to do the right thing, he just went about it in a really weird, backwards way. And surprise, surprise, trauma might make you do things in weird, backwards ways. It's also interesting to me how Rainer's hatred for Marvin eventually seems to channel into a hatred for his family as a whole. Sorry for bringing it up again, but this can be most clearly seen in the description of Care A. I'm back. This is my present for you. I started in 1996 for Marvin. If you think they're worth any effort, see if you can save Care B or Care and LM. Care B isn't the school, of course. Fuck you all, and fuck me as well. Merry Christmas. Check your bathroom now. So yeah, this definitely has some pretty grim implications, and it definitely reads as a suicide note to me. After what happened to Care, Rainer finished Petscop and, racked with guilt and anger, took his own life, leaving the game behind as a Christmas gift for his fucked up family. The OST featuring an unused track called Bathroom Tomb doesn't exactly inspire confidence either. While Rainer was clearly shown to be pretty nihilistic already, I think what happened to Care might have been the tipping point for him. His family allowed this to happen to Lena, him, maybe Michael, then Belle, and then finally Care. He might have lost all faith in his family, or maybe humanity as a whole at that point, and just decided it wasn't worth living anymore. Eventually, a lot of the language he uses regarding the family feels almost cultish, like rebirthing Belle into the family, and the way he describes the caskets. When these are done, they'll be great. Anyone who sees them is sure to become part of the family. It's definitely a bitter sense of sarcasm, which is common for Rainer. He often writes in this very dry anger and cynical way. Throughout the caskets, you can see his growing resentment, not just towards Marvin, but Anna and even Care. He becomes disgusted by her warped, spinning figure. Side note, but this is probably why Paul freaked out when he saw it, and also I find it worth noting that for other players, Paul's head looks very similar to the casket. But that's besides the point. I feel like you really can't blame Rainer for having the attitude he does towards his family. As the series progresses, we see Paul developing an increasingly fraught relationship with them, and fairly early on they seem to compromise control of the YouTube channel, an arrangement Paul doesn't seem entirely happy with. After the episode of the vase, they pop in at the end with a "we," and ominously imply that they know what the future caskets are going to be. This isn't a surprise since we later learn that the caskets exist in the game already, but it does make you question their motivations a little. There's also something to be said for how they seem to be more concerned with the game than Paul's well-being. While Paul has been through a metric fuck-ton of trauma, and the game is even about him, they twist his arm into continuing to play on their terms. They seem to prey on his natural curiosity and proclivity for exploration, using him as a means to solve the game. And eventually we see that the game is taking a toll on his family relationships. While he never seems to have been especially close with them, since the last time he remembers seeing them was when he was a toddler, I imagine that's probably what this scene is, I can't imagine being the center of a game about how fucked they are helped. Apparently Paul got in an argument with Aunt Jill about it, and he even tells Belle that they intimidate him at one point.
I don't like talking to them. They intimidate me. And I'm sure they wouldn't intimidate you at all. Yeah, no, it's fine. No, you don't want her calling you anyway. Like, you won't be able to escape that's the thing, if she were to start, yeah.
At this point, he doesn't even seem to be aware that they're monitoring him.
I'm not showing the family until I've seen it myself. I don't know, I'm not recording, I stopped it.
That's what I think Belle was trying to tell him in the game in this episode. She was gesturing for him to look that way in the real world, and when he looked he'd see a bug or something. That's probably why Paul expresses confusion, because he thinks that he's supposed to be looking somewhere in the game, but she's not talking about the game. The cult-like language Rainer uses feels appropriate when we hear about things like the game being passed through the family like some kind of weird heirloom. After Marvin appears for the first time, he's on the phone with presumably Aunt Jill, and from this conversation we learn that his mother had the game in 2005. Also, interestingly, he uses the word purportedly, like he doesn't know that for a fact, he just has heard it through hearsay, which also implies that he's estranged from his immediate family. The game is almost an object of worship to them, and in that way they miss the point of the gift entirely. While Rainer wanted to put them in their place by showing them how they'd failed kids like him and Michael and Care and Belle, they end up just perpetuating this problem with their own overinvestment into the game, shoving aside the feelings of Paul for their own wishes. That allows me to segue nicely into talking about one of the most eerie episodes of the series, Petscop 16. In this episode, we are shown an ominous warning that the user has gone AFK and not to turn the console off. We are then shown the ghost room, a schematic of a sparse bedroom with nothing but a bed, a TV, and the piano with the PS1 controller. A blinking dot, presumably representative of Paul, then gets out of the bed and sits in front of the TV. It's decidedly one of the creepiest episodes of the series. The blaring alarm brings to mind those traumatizing TV weather alerts from your childhood, the implication that something bad will happen if the console's turned off, the mysterious censored phone number, the idea that Paul is being monitored by the game, it's all delightfully disturbing. But that aside, what is it? I think the ghost room is some permutation of the quitter's room. As I said before, I think the quitter's room was a real-life place where Belle was held at one point, and while it doesn't exactly match the layout, it's similarly sparse. This is also reinforced by Belle seemingly playing the septet in Petscop 7, since it only plays when she's not there. The quitter's room seemingly also has a means to play the piano. Care might have been trapped in a similar place, and this is also implied by Kirby's description telling us that she's scared and pounding on the door, and her being located in a closet in the game. The ghost room might be a more realistic depiction of the real-life quitter's room, where Care and Belle were forced to do nothing but sleep and play the modified piano. Diegetically, Rainer may have included this feature as some kind of contingency in case something horrible did happen to them. Well, I guess whatever's more horrible than what they were already going through. Hell, maybe the message for AI Belle was for real-life Belle too, or existed for her in some capacity. That would explain why she was asked if she was still sitting on a chair in a room, or if there even was a room anymore. She might have just been left to her own devices in the ghost room. But as is my catchphrase throughout this video, I don't think this is entirely literal. Up to this point, we've seen implications that Paul is being trapped by the game, through his family making continue playing, his being trapped in the quitter's room in Petscop 10, the lack of a quit game option altogether, and now this. It's also indicated that the game itself seems to be meshing more and more with reality. My favorite way this idea is conveyed is the hidden loading screens. They start as things like a crude depiction of Belle and blurry renders of areas in the game, but slowly become more abstract, like this 3D depiction of Marvin's face and this weird artifacted image of, I think, the piano? Eventually, in Marvin's gameplay, we see probably the eeriest one yet, what appears to be a real image of Care's crayons. The splash screen here kind of implies that if Paul's not playing the game, he's having some kind of medical emergency, and symbolically, through the game, he's being dragged back into the past. Through the game, he's reliving his experience being trapped in the Quitter's Room while under Marvin's captivity. The Ghost Room is a ship in a bottle. What is a ship in a bottle? It's a model of something bigger, shrunken down and trapped for observation. The Ghost Room, and perhaps Paul's experience with Petscop in general, is that to his trauma. I think that's also a good point on which to segue into discussion of Petscop 21, which is honestly one of my favorite episodes of the series. It's not really a good segue, just pretend like it is. While at first it just seems to be a recording of Care absent-mindedly dancing around a room in even Care, the description of the video, just the sign, is actually a hint. It is indeed Care dancing, but upon further analysis you can see that her movements aren't arbitrary. Her movements actually synchronize with the melody of The Sign by Ace of Base, which I love for a multitude of reasons. 1, that song is a bop. 2, it's a very quintessentially 90s song, which is a great world and atmosphere building choice. And 3, it's just very cute. I think Sagan Hawks put it well when he said that a lot of stuff like this can fall into the FNAF trap of having victims be faceless cardboard cutouts to be punched into some kind of lore-solving equation. While I think this is less of an issue with FNAF since the novel trilogy, it's definitely a valid criticism. Suffice it to say though, Petscop dodges this pitfall pretty well. An episode like this is great at humanizing Care, showing that, above all else, she was just a little girl who liked to dance and spin and draw. Like, you can totally picture her dancing around the house with this song playing on the TV, or coordinating a silly dance number in her cousin's video game around a literal sign. It makes what would happen to her all the more tragic. But, you know me, I would also be remiss not to mention the obvious thematic connections with the song. The most common interpretation of the sign, and probably the most accurate one, is that it's about the singer realizing they're in and subsequently leaving a toxic relationship. Is a message broadly applicable to several Petscop characters, but the first character fitting this description that comes to mind for me anyway is Rainer. Look, I'm sorry I keep making everything about him, he's just my little sopping wet cat of a man. Also, he's basically the unreliable narrator of Petscop, so understanding his perspective is kind of key to understanding Petscop as a whole. Anyway, yeah, while the song is probably more upbeat than Rainer was, the principle remains the same. After seeing The Sign, that being either Belle's failed rebirth or what happened to Michael, or both, Rainer turned on Marvin and eventually the family in general. He realized that Marvin was a horrible person and his family was largely complicit in his crimes. However, if you look at it a little more closely, The Sign actually feels like appropriate foreshadowing for the rapidly incoming ending. And I think that's a good note on which to move on to my final topic, the ending. So first let me just give a brief summary of the events of the ending. After finally descending into the school basement, a sign tells him that you'll find the machine up ahead. This is the only entry or exit. You'll pass through this room again as you leave. Keep in mind, everything here, your baby will see. After catching Care B, he enters the machine room, where Marvin and Belle are waiting ominously. The machine consumes all his accumulated pieces, and Care B is put in the machine. He then plays the Needles piano again, and while at first he seems to play Care's melody, he ends up playing what the captions call Paul's melody. Marvin becomes angered and leaves the room, and when the machine turns back around, Paul is given a red and yellow egg. The description simply reads, ? You should start thinking about that. After this, Paul places the egg in the locker with Lena's letter and the purple and pink egg before leaving the school. The sun rises on the newmaker plane, and Paul opens the door and walks away. Okay, so what was that all about? A lot of symbolic meanings have been attributed to this ending, both positive and negative, but I view it as pretty uplifting. Paul defies the worldviews of both Rainer and Marvin. He plays his own melody and chooses to be his own person. You can't go back in time, sure, but you can change the meaning of what happened. Paul is Paul, just as much as he is Care. He's not beyond rebirthing, he's embraced who he is, symbolized by the red and yellow egg. And then what about, you should start thinking about that? If that sounds familiar, it's because it appears all the way back in Petscop 1 in Amber's description. Where's the safest place to put her? You should start thinking about that. So what Paul does with the egg seems to be a response to that query, putting it in the locker with Belle's egg and Lena's letter. Again, this reads as fairly optimistic to me. The safest place Paul can be is with his adoptive family, the people who truly care about him. It's not necessarily with his, quite frankly, abusive biological family. The epilogue encapsulates this idea pretty succinctly. In the newly brightened newmaker plane, Belle asks Paul the question he was posed all the way back in Petscop 2. Do you remember being born? And describes how Lena smuggled him and Belle away in the middle of the night, to begin a new life. When Belle says she could not wait to be his friend, Paul responds with a simple one-word answer: family. Belle is not just Paul's friend, she's his family. Indeed, Paul was born again, but this time not as Carrie Mark, as Paul Leskowitz. And that is how the sign relates to Paul and Belle by extension. is an apt description of the ending. Paul opened the door and walked away. He stopped letting his biological family in the game control and abuse him.
No one's gonna drag you up to get into the light where you belong. But where do you belong?
Paul belongs with his found family as him and his sister Belle fall into the loving arms of their mother Lena. Ultimately, I think this is the message Petscop is trying to get across. I often see this attitude in the community that rebirth is an inherently negative thing. I can't blame people for thinking that, since our primary example of this idea is with Care, a non-consensual forced rebirth by Marvin. I think it's more appropriate to say, though, that a forced rebirth is inherently bad. You can't force someone to be something they're not through sheer will. It's like with the melody thing from before. A melody doesn't just go from point A to point B, it has a sense of progression, a narrative arc. That principle also applies to individuals. Your identity isn't static. As your life changes, so do you as a person. That's especially applicable in the case of someone like Paul, a seemingly assigned female at birth person who generally presents and identifies as a guy. I don't know, maybe I'm projecting a little as a GNC person, but I think you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who woke up one day and was just an entirely different person. Not that it's impossible, but I doubt it's reflective of most people's experiences. It reads to me as a reclamation. Yes, Paul will be reborn, but on his own terms, as his own person. He won't be the person that Marvin or Rainer or his family want him to be. He'll be the person that he wants himself to be. I really don't think it can be overstated how special Petscop is. While plenty of protégés have followed in its wake, many being fantastic in their own rights, I think the cultural footprint it left really has cemented its place in the YouTube horror zeitgeist. And I don't know, it just has a certain je ne sais quoi that's really struck a chord with me, and I think many others. With other series in this vein, I can objectively appreciate them as good pieces of art. Interloper has been one of my personal favorites lately, by the way, but there haven't been any that have touched my soul the way Petscop has. Underneath all its abstract imagery and the smoke and mirrors of its figurative language, Petscop really is an incredibly human story, which feels kind of funny to say about a game whose main character is an olive green butt with a beak. All joking aside though, Petscop casts its net so wide that you'd be hard-pressed not to find at least some aspect you can relate to. Abuse, complicated family dynamics, struggles with identity and gender, mental health issues, it's really just trauma bingo. And I think that really goes to prove the ultimate thesis of Petscop. We are who we are, defined by our experiences, and that's something we have to accept with all the agony and pain it comes with, but also all the beauty and joy. You get to live your life on your own terms and nobody else's. It may be difficult, but in that way, it's also liberating. Thank you all so much for watching. Again, this video has been boiling in the back of my head for years now, and I finally decided to lay it all out. I know last episode I said it was going to be 3 parts, but that was back when the script was just going to be me recounting Petscop to you, and that was really boring, so that's not what this is anymore. I honestly probably could go on for 2 more parts because there just is so much to analyze thematically and philosophically with Petscop. But there's already such a wealth of content on YouTube that I think you should go explore what other people have to say. Like I mentioned earlier, Mr. Seat's rotation theory, absolutely watch that one, that's fantastic. Sagan Hawks' video is really good. Nexpo also does a really good thorough analysis of things. The last few game theories were pretty good, focusing more on like the AI angle. And there's also plenty more great ones that I haven't watched. Like Nightmare Masterclasses, I know was one of the first ones like on the ground floor with Petscop. So yeah, I'll leave some links to some further recommended watching in the description about Petscop. As for my next video, I do plan to resume Fandom Follies. I think next episode is probably going to be Charlie, which means that after that's going to be Cassidy, and then that's going to be the end of it, and then I have a whole other backlog of things I want to make. The Charlie video might receive the same rework that this one did, though, because it's existed in my notes app for like half a year now, and it actually predates the Elizabeth video and the Vanessa video, but for some reason I just haven't gotten around to it. While I do think she's a great character, I think there is just a lot more concrete stuff to go off for Elizabeth and Vanessa, which is why it was easier to make those first. And a lot of the stuff that I have right now is very much my interpretation and probably pretty contested. Either way though, it should be out within the next month and a half-ish, hopefully, because I at least already have a framework for what I'm doing. But I think that's enough out of me. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, maybe leave a like, leave a comment, add some feedback of your own. Petscop is so open-ended that I'd love to hear other interpretations. You could also subscribe. I mostly do FNAF videos usually, but I also cover other kind of FNAF adjacent horror things, like I did that detention video a few years ago, which I'm really proud of. And there's also the random Better Call Saul video I did, but that's kind of an outlier. Again, I love you guys all so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.